You think Biden can do that? He can.
It's a good thing what he did. And this is not political. I don't mean this as political, but it was weird as the way he signed that. It was weird as like, I'm looking at that signature right now. Does that even say Donald Trump? The last name is longer than his first name. It doesn't look like, it looks like it says Leonard Skinner. It doesn't even, it doesn't make any sense.
The Daily Show breaking down President Trump's enthusiastic bill signing from Saturday morning. We have a lot to cover this morning, including the uncertainty surrounding a second round of talks between the United States and Iran, as Tehran is demanding a specific person from the Trump administration be involved. We'll tell you who that is and talk about why. It comes as another round of in-person talks between officials from Israel and Lebanon are set for this week in Washington. We'll look at what could come from those negotiations. Meanwhile, another cabinet member is leaving the Trump administration amid multiple misconduct allegations. We'll tell you who it is and go through the details of that departure. And on Capitol Hill, the president's pick to be the next Federal Reserve chair will have his confirmation hearing today. But will it even matter, given the promise by Republican Senator Tom Tillis to block any nominations while the Trump administration investigates current Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell? And good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It is Tuesday, April 21st. With us, we have the co-host of our 9 a.m. hour, staff writer at The Atlantic, Jonathan Lemire, and President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, is with us this morning. Good to have you. So once again, our top story this morning, Willie, Iran. Yeah, two sides telling very different stories of what's going on right now. The United States and Iran continue to send conflicting signals ahead of possible peace talks as the ceasefire deadline looms. There are some signs of progress this morning. A foreign diplomat inside Tehran, close to the talks, tells MS Now an Iranian delegation led by the country's parliamentary speaker and foreign minister will travel to Islamabad today for negotiations with the U.S., but only if Vice President J.D. Vance is there. Two U.S. officials, meanwhile, tell the New York Times Vance is expected to leave Washington for Islamabad today. Pakistan also actively preparing for a second round of talks, deploying thousands of additional security personnel across the area. Both parties, however, ramping up their rhetoric ahead of a potential meeting. Iran's parliamentary speaker posted to social media yesterday, writing, "We do not accept negotiations under the shadow of threats," adding Iran is, quote, prepared to reveal new cards on the battlefield. President Trump, meanwhile, told Bloomberg he is highly unlikely to extend the ceasefire if a deal is not reached before tomorrow night, that's Wednesday night, Eastern time. When asked by PBS News what happens if the truce does expire, the president said, quote, then lots of bombs start going off. So, Richard Haass, you are a resident diplomat. Help.
Not saying much.
Help. Yeah. I mean, we can catalog and we have all the contradictory statements that have come from the White House and from Iran, but particularly from President Trump, about how things are going, when the war is going to end, when these talks will happen, when they'll wrap up, when there will be peace in our time. What should someone sitting at home watching this make of what you're hearing right now?
I would stop listening to those comments. Quite honestly, he's devalued the currency of presidential statement, and all these threats, I don't think impressed the Iranians. What if we hit 13,000 targets or something? So if we hit 500 more, it's almost so what? They've shown that they can take a punch. They've shown their resilience, and many times also, as you all know, he backs away. So I don't think that's helping. And by putting pressure on Iran, it actually makes it slightly more difficult for them to be forthcoming at the negotiating table. A big part of the Iranian approach to negotiations is one of what you might call of dignity. I've negotiated with them myself several times in the past. One of the reasons they want the vice president there is a sign of respect and of level of the talks. They also, shall we say, have some issues with Messrs. Kushner and Witkoff, given that the last two times they led talks, it was in some ways a cover for the launching of military attacks. I think the other big problem, Willie, besides the gap on the issues, the substance, is the Iranian delegation. This, one of the things no one seems to have thought of in this long shot hope for regime change is that by killing so many people, we have totally disrupted the hierarchy of decision making in Iran. You have more radical people coming to the fore. So what you have is an erratic U.S. side, an Israeli side that's essentially uninterested in peace, and an Iranian side that's more radical and divided. It's not clear who has the authority to make peace. That is not, shall we say, a great context for peace talks to take place.
Yeah, the attempt to kill their way and from the United States side out of this problem, kill the regime, has only made it more extreme.
100%.
So what is on the table? Let's say these peace talks do happen in Islamabad. Let's say Vice President Vance does arrive. Iran says, okay, great, the vice president's here, let's talk. What is even on the table? What's between those 40-yard lines that they might agree on to put an end to this war?
There's two principal issues, and then there's any number of other things. Two principal issues are the strait, getting end of the blockade, getting the Iranians to back off their quote-unquote control of the strait, one thing. Second of all, the nuclear issue, how to deal with the nuclear material, how to deal with the future of the Iranian nuclear program. And the president yesterday putting out a post essentially suggesting that we're prepared to negotiate and accept limits that, shall we say, look a little bit like some of the previous limits. Then there's issues like the relaxation of sanctions, return of frozen assets, questions of Iranian conventional military forces, ballistic missile programs, which was the biggest Israeli concern before this war, drone programs, things like that, their support for proxy groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and so forth. So you've got the two principal issues, again, the nuclear and the strait. Then you've got a host of additional issues that actually may complicate things if we are actually, big question, if they are to be resolved as part of this process.
Jonathan Lemire, what are you hearing from the White House? I mean, this seems at this point that this has gone longer than President Trump would desire. Has the White House sort of misinterpreted how much control they would have over the situation?
Oh, significantly so. President Trump was initially of the belief this was going to be a conflict that would be over in a matter of days, a couple weeks at most, similar to what we saw in Venezuela, and that they would be able to prop up a more conciliatory leader there. That, of course, not the case. And to what Richard just said, even harder line, leaders are now in place in Tehran, at least for the moment. And it's unclear. There's also a split there in their leadership and how much of there is an appetite for them to want negotiations. And the Strait of Hormuz is certainly the key. And it's just unclear what Iran would do to give up the leverage they have. That seems a pretty firm line for them. They're willing to open it, but they want to collect a toll. And therefore, the White House, at least for now, is saying that's unacceptable, which would mean they'd leave the war, at the end of the war, with more control than they had it at the start, which would certainly be a loss for Washington. And then there's the political angle of this. And for that, let's bring in Politics Bureau Chief and Senior Political Columnist at Politico, Jonathan Martin, now with us. J. Mark, good to see you.
Hey, John.
The vice president here is an unlikely figure at the center of this. But I think that may be why, in fact, the Iranians want to talk to him. To Richard's point, he is, the second most powerful person in the government. So that is a sign of respect. But he's also someone who, frankly, had real reservations about this conflict in its early days. And his team made clear that we all heard about those reservations in the conflict in its early days. So there's a sense here that he might be a more reasonable voice, to get to a deal to end the war. But it's also, look, yes, there's 2028 in the looming over the horizon as well. Talk to us, if you will, about the Vance role here and, frankly, the pressure that he has.
Well, yeah, for one, the Iranians do think that they're getting prestige and they're getting proximity, right? Somebody who does have the ear of the president and somebody who's got a big title. Secondly, yeah, as you pointed out, they believe that they're getting the biggest dove in the room, which is to say, the person in the West Wing who is the most eager for diplomacy, who is less enthusiastic about combat. So there are those two things. What's striking is that everybody here domestically in the States is looking at this as a classic VP assignment, John, which is to say not the best gig in the world, because typically the VP gets the hardest job. And that gets to the heart of what you're asking, which is, boy, if Vance can't deliver here, or if Vance delivers a bum steer, this is not going to help his, frankly, already difficult straits looking at trying to run in 2028 in the wake of Donald Trump. It's always hard for a VP to run in his own right. As you guys know, only George H.W. Bush in '88 has pulled it off immediately after the president they served. So it's already difficult. You're trying to solve this Rubik's Cube. It is really difficult. And I think Trump wants to find any way to declare victory. But you and I know that in 2 years, Trump's version of declaring victory could look a little less, well, shall we say, victorious in hindsight.
Let's bring in the conversation defense editor at The Economist, Shashank Joshi. His latest work in the war is titled, Which Iran is America Dealing With? It's great to have you with us. Take us inside, if you will, the perspective of the Iranian regime right now. I know you say there's some signs of fraying there, but as they approach these negotiations, they've withstood 8 weeks of war here. They found this new leverage point in the Strait of Hormuz. How are they viewing these negotiations?
Well, good morning. And yeah, thank you for having me. My colleagues have done some excellent reporting from inside Iran. And the picture we get is a cacophony. You know, it depends which Iran are you talking to. If you look at the last delegation that the Iranians sent to Islamabad, it had 80 Iranians. About 30 of them were billed as decision makers. You had some very pragmatic diplomats who had worked on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that deal signed by Barack Obama's administration back in 2018. And you had effectively nationalist firebrands who derided America, sneered at the idea of a deal. And what we've reported is that, you know, these intra-Iranian disputes were so fractious that the Pakistani mediators at times had to spend as much time arbitrating amongst the Iranians as they did between the Iranians and the Americans. So you can see these huge splits even within Iran over how to proceed.
And how do they view President Trump right now? Perhaps they felt the brunt of the United States military, but in terms of his rhetoric and that he says we're close to a deal, the war is near the end. If we don't meet a deal by the end of the ceasefire, the bombs will start to fall again. He talked about wiping out an entire civilization. Do they view that all as bluster, or how are they reading President Trump in Iran?
I think here again it depends on which Iranians we're looking at, but by and large I share the assessment that Richard Haas made earlier, that the president has devalued the currency of these threats, because we have seen so many over the years, not just the months, over the years, which ultimately turn out to be completely baseless. And here I would just take a moment to remind people that back in 2020, I think it was, in President Trump's first term, he also threatened to bomb Iranian cultural sites. A threat that, of course, was met with, at the time, considerable disquiet within the Pentagon and many other departments because of the illegality that would involve. But, of course, he didn't follow through on it. You may recall he backed down from bombing Iran on that occasion when they had downed an American drone. And now, with so many deadlines passed, ignored, dismissed, I think the Iranians will recognize, for all the reasons we've been identifying, they will feel they have more staying power in this than the American side.
What stands out in this entire situation is not just the geopolitical tension, but the growing gap between what is said and what is actually credible. In modern politics, words are supposed to signal intent, shape expectations, and guide outcomes. But when statements constantly shift, contradict each other, or fail to materialize, they begin to lose value. And once that happens, even serious threats or promises start to sound like background noise. The discussion around negotiations with Iran highlights this problem perfectly. On one side, there are claims of progress, confidence, and imminent resolution. On the other, there are warnings of escalation, deadlines, and consequences. When both narratives exist at the same time, they don't balance each other, they cancel each other out. For an ordinary observer, it becomes nearly impossible to understand what is wackery and what is simply positioning. This confusion is not harmless. Diplomacy relies heavily on clarity and trust, even between adversaries. When one side cannot reliably interpret the other's intentions, it increases the risk of miscalculation. And in situations involving military conflict, miscalculation is one of the most dangerous outcomes possible. Another important layer here is the role of perception. The idea that a specific high-ranking official must be present for talks is not just about logistics, it is about signaling respect and seriousness. In international negotiations, symbols matter. Who shows up, where they meet, and how they speak all contribute to the tone of the discussions. When those signals are inconsistent, it complicates the process before it even begins. At the same time, the internal dynamics on both sides appear fractured. The reporting suggests divisions within the Iranian leadership, with different factions holding different views on whether to negotiate at all. But instability is not limited to one side. When leadership teams change frequently, or when key figures face allegations and departures, it raises questions about continuity and coherence. Negotiations are already difficult. they become even harder when the people involved may not be in their roles long enough to see them through. The commentary about threats also deserves attention. Repeated warnings of extreme action may initially project strength, but over time, they risk becoming less influential. If threats are made too often without follow-through, they start to feel less serious. This does not necessarily make the situation safer, it can actually make it more unpredictable. Opponents may begin to ignore warnings, increasing the chance that a real escalation catches everyone off guard. There is also a deeper strategic question at play. What does winning actually mean in this context? Declaring success in a conflict is easy from a rhetorical standpoint, but much harder in reality. True resolution requires stable agreements, mutual understanding, and a clear path forward. Without those elements, any claim of victory is temporary at best. The involvement of different voices within the administration adds another layer of complexity. Some figures are perceived as more inclined toward diplomacy, others toward confrontation. This internal diversity can be valuable if it leads to balanced decision-making, but if it results in mixed messaging, it can weaken the overall position. Negotiating partners may try to exploit these differences or simply become unsure of who truly speaks with authority. Meanwhile, the broader public conversation continues to blur the line between serious policy discussion and entertainment. Jokes about signatures or public appearances may seem trivial, but they reflect a larger trend where optics often overshadow substance. When leadership is constantly framed through a lens of spectacle, it becomes harder to focus on the real stakes involved. Ultimately, what we are seeing is a system under strain, not just because of external conflict, but because of internal inconsistencies. Effective leadership requires more than bold statements. It requires coherence, credibility, and the ability to maintain a steady course even under pressure. Right now, that steadiness feels uncertain. And in a situation where the consequences are global, uncertainty is not just a political problem, it is a strategic risk.